We're live.
Well, hello, gang. We're live here from Sugartown. We've got Lover Girl on the camera, the dog's around, the boy's hiding. And there's Sugar Pie Honey Bunch. We'll play some Sugar Pie DeSanto for her later today. And let us go ahead, we'll spend, who knows, an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, the whole weekend or something together as we're going here. So today, I think we're going to start out with a bunch of rock and roll stuff, and then maybe give a salute to first a salute to my sister Jackie, who may be watching here, who got me started on early country music. You know, she was a huge Hank Williams fan. Luckily, there was an 18-year span from myself to my sister Jackie, the other kids in between. And they all had the coolest records and stuff. My brother had a guitar. And they didn't realize when they were playing and dancing around, I was the guy in the back looking around, you know, when I was too young, just playing the guitar and then reading the liner notes and figuring out, you know, who's on some of these records and stuff. We'll talk about maybe the rock and roll trio, Johnny Burnett, Dorsey Burnett. And in fact, let's go ahead. We'll start with spinning this one. We're going to do Tear It Up, which they wrote. And Tear It Up, I don't know if our friends, maybe Albert Lee, Jimmy Cowan, anybody listening and stuff. But Albert covers this one and loves it. And these were the Dorsey brothers from the Lauderdale Projects in Memphis, where they used to play with Elvis in the basement, which we stayed in, by the way, Don and I. We'll tell you more about that.
And Pete and Elena.
And Pete and Elena, that's right. If all you kids are listening. So we have a bunch of good stuff on there. And we'll start with the Dorsey brothers, rock and roll trio.
Come on, little baby, let's tear that dance floor up. Come on, little baby, let's tear that dance floor up. Come on, little mama, let me see you strut that stuff. Tear it up, tear it up, tear it up, tear it up. Come on, little baby, let me see you strut that stuff. I'm a little baby, gonna be gone a long, long time. I'm a little baby, gonna be gone a long, long time. Oh, come on, little baby, you show me real good right. Tear it up, tear it up, tear it up, tear it up. Oh, come on, little mama, let's tear it up.
Oh, and Jackie's on. Hi, Jackie.
Well, you step back, baby, do my way. Step around and get it easy. Tear it up.
Hi from Cousin Tonto.
Cousin Tonto, Jeff Ballenberg.
Come on,
Cool. Yeah. Jeff and I had an excursion when Jeff was with RCA Records. And I was just thinking about it the other day. Do you still have your autograph, Jerry Lee Lewis? And there's a story about it. While we're on with Cousin Tonto there, that's Jeff Ballenberg. And Jeff may know, let me see, well, Jimmy Cowan might be on. Jim was at RCA for a while. And Cousin Tonto and I, who, that's Jeff's nickname, did a lot of things back in the day. And one of the fun things, we were playing with Jerry Lee Lewis. And at this point in Jerry Lee Lewis's career, it was probably around 87, something like that. And he was getting all those awful write-ups in Rolling Stone magazine that he killed ex-wives and this and that. He was in the press. And he was out touring. So we were playing the belly up. Jeff was down for the show. And he didn't use the regular belly up dressing rooms that we all are familiar with, that we all use. He had a really cheesy RV they got for him in the back parking lot. So you had to kind of just go and knock and do the secret knock and go in to see Jerry Lee. So he's sitting there with a couple of bloated tarts on each arm, a couple of blondes, and I keep coming in. Actually, I have a very cool 45, which I think was probably my sister Jackie's on Sun Records that I had him sign. So I had him sign that, and I've got a cool one when I played with Roy Orbison too. I had Roy play. or signed. But anyway, getting back to the Jerry Lee Lewis one. So he was all kind of chuckles and full of himself and having a lot of fun talking about the Rolling Stone write-ups about all this stuff with him supposedly murdering ex-wives and getting away with it and stuff. So he was really happy to sign things, and I think, Jeff, he signed one of your business cards or whatever we had at the time. So I've been seeing you do your stub posts and stuff, and I was wondering if you still have the Jerry Lee Lewis autograph, and if so, maybe pop that one up. That was kind of a fun, interesting evening. Now, what Jerry Lee would do, too, he loved the theater of the show. And what I mean by that is he would always start something early on in his show. He'd throw a fit. The piano's out of tune, or it's the wrong color, this and that. And he'd storm off stage and say, I'm not going to play, and I'm not coming back. And the crowd would be going crazy and roaring and clapping for him to come back. And he'd come back and he'd act like he found the promoter, and he'd say something, and that's, I'm going to play, but it's out of tune. And it was always the threat that he was going to stop the show and go off. And that was one of his shticks he did all the time. And as we get a little closer to it, I've got a little bit of a Jerry Lee Lewis story. It was his plane that Rick Nelson had bought, and unfortunately the one that went down with the guys. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that, how I kind of dodged that also. But anyway, let's go on while we're on the rock and roll trio here, Johnny and Dorsey Burnett. Let me go spin another one for you. Their version of Train Kept a Rollin'. And we do this one right now in the Farmers. So we just started adding that one to the show. Many versions. And here. And again, I'm doing these with LPs. Their version of Train Kept a Rollin'. Okay, that's two from the rock and roll trio there out of Memphis. They're Burnett's. And then they had sons and nephews and stuff that went in the music business. And are still playing and doing pretty well. So a couple of things from them. I'm going to go to a little bit more of a city sound for a little bit. And then I'm going to come back to country. And then I've got a story in here too that, again, my sister Jackie probably doesn't realize some of the kids that we grew up in the projects with and who they are and what they did. I'm going to get to that one, and that's eventually going to link to Nashville in the 80s, and maybe with Georgianne Galante, if Georgianne is on, and her ex-husband Joe Galante, And they were kind of the ones that were instrumental in bringing me down to Nashville and introducing me to a lot of people and getting me in kind of the 80s Nashville clique with a bunch of really fun people. And I'll get to some of that here in a little bit. But going back to the Coasters were just wonderful, you know, rock and roll, not really a soul group, R&B a little bit. And a lot of their stuff was written by Lieber and Stoller, Jerry Stoller, Mike Lieber. And they were just a couple of Jewish kids that wanted to be black so bad. And they wrote so well. So they wrote a ton of stuff for the Coasters. And again, some of the stuff we cover now again on the Farmers, Old Mexico and stuff. And they have a really cool version. I'd like to play their version of Poison Ivy, which is a Lieber Stoller song. But one of the songs that I always have loved, and since I was a young little guy, Shopping for Clothes. In fact, let me play Shopping for Clothes first. And I think somebody should cover this one. And it's got Richard Berry doing the low vocals. And I think you guys know about Richard Berry and our connection with him. But I'll go into that story too for the folks that are new to our Richard Berry collection. And again, bear with me as I'm counting the tracks on here and trying to needle drop it. I'm looking for the 5th track. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And see if I've got it here. Shopping for clothes. Well, I should say shopping for clothes. That's sure a suit I'd like to own.
I was shopping for a suit the other day and walked into the department store. Stepped on the elevator and told the girl, drive in the truck. When I got off, I said, "Well, come to me." He said, "Now what can I do for you?" I said, "Well, go in there and show me all the store clothes. Like you boys." He said, "Well, sure. Come on in, buddy. Take these back. We got laid out on the shed." He said,
Pick yourself out one, try it on, stand in the mirror and dig yourself. That suit's pure hell.
"Yeah, that's a suit I'd like to own."
But that suit,
"Yeah, I believe it too. I see for the businessman, you teaching a natural show that retail, wholesale, and need. It got the custom cup and the walking chalk," he said.
I'm gonna let you have that steel.
"And for the playboy, you have the latest in tweed with the cutaway flap over white. It's a box back 2-button western model," he said.
I hate that night. Sometimes a solid gold.
"You made the deal, so
They call it pure Cadillac.
you just said that right there on that chair."
I swear I'm gonna get out of my pajamas.
Did you guys see her in her pajamas? And she got champagne too.
Now you go back there and get that seat and let me sign on the dotted line.
Saturday.
Make sure I get all my
Is
papers.
this the Saturday champagne? Did you already drink the Friday? Okay.
Where I can do the checking on you.
Then the man, he come back, he say, "I'm sorry, my man, but your,
Credit didn't do it.
well, what you mean? Ain't this a shame? My heart in pain. Pure heaven.
That's the suit you will never own.
Lord have mercy. I got a good job sweeping up every day.
Okay, before I play another Coasters track, the Richard Berry story that I've probably told a bunch of you guys about, but Richard Berry, he wrote, Have Love Will Travel. Louie Louie is his biggest hit, and that's the one the Kingsmen had the hit with. So the biggest hit in the sense the songs that he wrote. But back in the day, he was that real deep bass voice in the Coaster records. Charlie Brown and, why is everybody always picking on me? Well, back in the 80s, Buddy and I somehow became friends with Richard Berry. He was living up in L.A. And Richard was playing a lot of clubs in the L.A. scene for not a whole lot of money. He'd just go out and, come home, make a couple $100, put it in his pocket. He was a happy guy. People didn't realize, oh, I think Lovergirl just pinched my buttocks here. Hurry up back, Lovergirl.
Okay.
I'm on a Richard Berry story. So anyway, Richard was struggling in L.A., playing, having fun, but he wasn't living in the best neighborhood. And at the time, he was living next to a guy that had a bunch of pit bulls. And they had a chain link fence up between the houses. But, so the pit bulls were contained, and yet they were there. And they would run up and throw themselves against the fence and, just scare him every so often. So he's getting home at the end of a gig one night. It's probably 3 in the morning. And he's taking his guitar out of the car. And as he does, the pit bulls come running up from the neighbor, and they throw themselves at the fence. And he slips and falls. And he fell well enough to throw his back out. The poor guy was hurting so bad. He couldn't move, couldn't get up. So they wound up having to call the ambulance for him, take him to the emergency room. So Richard arrives at the hospital, and he's filling out the papers and stuff, and he's worried it's going to cost him a lot of money. So he finally gets in to see the emergency room doctor, and as they're checking him out and moving him around and touching him here and there, they're looking at the paperwork, and the doctor, here it's 4 in the morning in L.A., is making small talk with Richard, saying, oh, well, see here, you're a songwriter, you're a musician, and he's moving around, and Richard, oh, yeah, but just tell you what, Doc, give me a couple of pain pills and send me home. I can't afford this. I can't have x-rays. I can't do this. And the doctor is saying, well, Richard, as I'm looking at your paperwork here, it says you're a songwriter. And if you're a songwriter and musician, you're probably making pretty decent money. Did you write anything I may have heard of? And Richard is used to this drill. He says, yeah, I did. If you believe me or not, but I wrote Louie to Louie. And the doctor said, well, the only Louie Louie I know is Louie Louie by the Kingsmen. That, Louie Louie, me gotta go. And Richard said, yeah, that's the one I wrote. I wrote that. And the doctor said, well, if you wrote that, you can afford to pay for this emergency room visit. And Richard says, well, actually, I'm not making any money from it. I can't. So the doctor again says, if it's that Louie Louie we're talking about, I know it by the Kingsmen, that got me through my fraternity, through college, through medical school. That was our fraternity's favorite song, Louie Louie. And Richard was convincing enough for him, so the doctor finally said, well, I tell you what, if this is legit, I've got a friend who's an entertainment attorney, and I'll have him look into it for you. And we'll go from there. So the doctor believed him, and once he sent Richard home, or whatever he did for him, gave him some pain pills and put him on therapy and stuff, sent him home, the doctor, to his credit, looked into it for him and found out that, yes, indeed, Richard did write Louie Louie. So his friend, the entertainment attorney, made it his first point of interest to try to get Richard's rights back to him. Richard had lost or signed away all his rights to the record. So right before Buddy and I kind of really started recording with Richard, got him down for some songs we did, he got a settlement, and he got a bunch of money in, and I think he got something like $6 million for his back royalties. So for the last few years of Richard's life, it was a shame he died of cancer a few years later, but he lived well finally. And it was funny, he didn't drive, he always took the train, he'd take the Amtrak down from Los Angeles, and we'd have to go down and pick him up at the station and bring him over to the studio. And he was the nicest guy. His vices in the studio were Dentine red gum, and he loved Hershey bars with no almonds. So we were actually recording, and if Jim McGinnis is on here, at Hit Single under College Grove, which a lot of you guys probably remember the studios there. So I would go up the stairs from Hit Single record or recording studio and go to the Long's Drug there and buy Richard big bars of, theater-sized bars of Hershey bars with no almonds and big packs of the Dentine red chewing gum. So that's what he would use in the studio to kind of get through the sessions. But it was fun sitting there talking to him about the old stories. And again, Buddy and I are telling him, we're little kids and we're listening to these great Coasters records, and he's doing these wonderful vocals on it. So anyway, to get back to playing some music on the Coasters, I was going to play maybe Love Potion number 9. Let me play you one or two that are just such sexy versions of these songs that you may have heard by other people, but the Coasters versions are something. So let's see what I can find on here. I did talk about Poison Ivy. I think I want to play Riot in Cell Block number 9. Again, another Lieber Stoller song. These guys wrote a ton. Tremendous version.
On July the 2nd,
Richard Berry.
1953, I was serving time for armed robbery. At 4 o'clock in the morning, I was sleeping in my cell. I heard a whistle blow, then I heard somebody yell.
Listen to the sax.
The trouble started in cell block number 5. It spread like Bob, who crossed the prison block. I said, okay, boys, I'm getting ready to run. Here come the warden with the Tommy gun. Said, come out with your hands up in the air. If you don't stop this ride, you all gonna get the chair. Scarface Jones said it's too late to quit. Pass the dynamite, cause the fuse is lit. In the 47th hour, the tear gas got our men. We're all back in ourselves, but every now and then.
Richard Berry. The Coasters and all those Lieber Stoller classics. Anyway, so here is some early rock and roll stuff, kind of city sounding stuff, which is going to lend me up to country in New York City. Now, country was actually always fairly big in New York City. People didn't want to believe it, but it did pretty well. Now, the country business, and I'm going to get in over like the next half an hour or some country finances of the country record business that I learned in Nashville, or from being taught in Nashville. And at the time, country music was mainly a singles business. And what I mean by that, if somebody was signed to a country deal, it was a side deal. You might get signed to 8 sides, 10 sides, or whatever, and it was a singles business. So if your single hit, it was usually a huge hit in the country market, and rarely what they call a crossover over to the pop. So if you could get a crossover, maybe something like Dave Dudley, 6 Days on the Road, or something to pop, oh, you made some money in the country market. So early on, one of the first bands to actually take a chance on going from singles to LPs, because when you do LPs, albums, that's where the money is made in the business. You've got all these things already stacked up, and rather than somebody buying a single for 99 cents, back in the day, if they buy a record for $7.99, the labels finally made their money off of doing LPs. Rock and roll, it had changed. We were all buying more LPs in the late 60s, and that's the album-oriented rock. Yeah, you'd want to hear the long versions of whatever, or an 18-minute version of this, and you buy 4-sided, gatefold, 2-record disc, those kind of things. But a groundbreaking record trying to make some money was Buck Owens playing live in Carnegie Hall in New York. So this was a huge record for the time. A lot of country bands didn't want to take a chance on that. Like I said, New York did have a lot of country, and we would go, again, my sister and our dad, we would go over to a show in Newark, New Jersey, the WJRZ used to put on. They were the country label, or country radio station out of Newark, New Jersey. And early on, I remember seeing one of Dolly Parton's first shows when she was opening up and singing with Porter Wagner, and we saw, I'm trying to think of the real old throwback ones. I mean, it was in the 60s, but when country was coming to the city, country coming to New York, trying to think of some other ones we saw there. But it was kind of cool back in the day going to Newark, and that seemed like a big travel for me going to Newark. So I'll get more into the singles, the albums, and Nashville after I start playing you. I'm going to play you the opening one from Buck Owens and the Buckaroos live at Carnegie Hall in New York City, which was a groundbreaking album.
Ladies and gentlemen, America's #1 country artist, a warm Carnegie Hall welcome for Buck Owens. They're gonna put me in the movies. They're gonna make a big star out of me. We'll make a scene about a man that's sad and lonely. All I gotta do is act naturally. Well, I'll bet you I'm gonna be a big star. I might win an Oscar, you can't never tell. The feds are gonna make me a big star, 'cause I can play the part so well. Well, I hope you'll come to see me in the movie. Then I know that you're gonna plainly see the biggest fool they ever hit the big time. All I gotta do is act naturally. We'll make a scene about a man that's sad and lonely.
No, it's got a computer posting
And a begging
some of you
girl
guys'
to
comments.
tend to
Gary, good deal here with Buck Owens.
And I'll play the part
I got a lot of
I
stories.
won't need rehearsing. All I gotta do is act naturally. Well, I'll bet you I'm gonna be a big star. I might win an Oscar, you can't never tell. The movies are gonna make me a big star, 'cause I can play the part so well. Well, I hope you'll come to see me in the movie. Then I know that you're gonna plainly see the biggest fool ever hit the big time. All I gotta do is act naturally. 2, 3, 4. All I gotta do is act naturally.
Okay, well that Buck Owens introduction is going to maybe lead me into New York City, the Galantes and Nashville. And what I mean by that, Joe Galante, well, a good friend, Georgianne Galante, who I haven't seen in years and years. Georgianne may be on here. Georgianne had married Joe, and that's why they had the same name, Galante, the same last name. Now, Joe was a bean counter for RCA Records in New York City. And what I mean by a bean counter, he wasn't in A&R, he had nothing to do with the artist end of the music. He was just kind of an accountant and stuff. Well, RCA Nashville was not thriving at the time. So they had asked, or not asked, they told Joe, well, you're being assigned to RCA Nashville for 2 years. You got to go down there. You can't say no to us. So Joe said, you know, I know nothing about the business. And they said, you're a great financier. You're a businessman. This is a business. You'll go down and you'll get him in shape. So Joe was a nervous wreck, and he figured, well, I'll go down there and do it. But he didn't really know much about music. He wasn't a musician like most people in the business are. He didn't play stuff. You know, maybe he noodled around on a guitar, Beatles songs, as we all did with kids and stuff, but he wasn't a working musician. He was just a bean counter. He was an accountant for him. So anyway, he wound up going down to Nashville, and he had run-ins with most of the people in Nashville because he was one of those there Italians from New York City coming down. And he had a huge run-in with Chet Atkins. Chet Atkins was kind of a big shot at the time. A lot of people didn't like. You go way back to when Elvis was cutting down there. Chet Atkins was his producer, and Elvis didn't like him. He had a lot of issues. Women didn't like him. He was a touchy-feely guy, if you know what I mean. A lot of people didn't like him. I'm talking about Chet Atkins. But so Joe had a big run-in with Chet Atkins, and he was learning the business when he first went down there. And he had to make some rough decisions because running a label is like running a bank. You take a chance on somebody. You put up some front money and you see if the record's going to click. It's like running, let's say, a football franchise. There are certain guys on the label that are worth their money. They might be the right age, they're performing well, they're an attraction for the fans, and they're making the team win. But then you have to come to that point of going, well, the player's getting a little bit older, they're not playing as well. We could maybe take it into, right now, a bunch of the quarterbacks and a bunch of, in baseball, maybe Mookie Betts being dumped by the Red Sox. Okay, they're dumping him just because of his salary. They have to do the math on it. If we dump him, and we'll get under the salary cap, maybe we get some young guys coming up. So labels have to make these rough decisions. Who they had, who had a big name. It's great to say, hey, I had Babe Ruth on my team, or I had such and such on the label, but they're not producing as much anymore. So when Joe went down to RCA in Nashville, he had to start dumping people like, Charlie Pride and, people that were well known on the label. So they didn't like him much at first, but he was starting to turn the label around. All of a sudden, the label was starting to make some money. So then they would have to go out and scout and find some of the younger folks that would come in that had a shot at making them some money. They're rookies. You sign them cheap, and as they come up, you're making some money with them. And then the deal was you wanted to try and get them from a singles deal. You wanted to try to sell some albums. And then you wanted to try to open up the scope of where country music was playing. It was kind of a, more or less, kind of maybe a triangle in those days. It was, Nashville on over to, a little bit in the west up to maybe St. Louis. In that triangle of the country is where country was really selling well and being promoted. So Joe had a few really good ideas, one of which was to get a lot of these artists in films and TV shows and so forth, because then they would be known for that, and then people would want to go buy their records, not only through a country market, but through pop. He'd have crossover hits. So he had a lot of these guys starting to record more on the albums. And to go back to, not even the early days, but until maybe in the 80s, if you were doing session work, a lot of session players, you would get paid per the session. And in Nashville, and other places too, most of the sessions was a 3-hour session, and you had to cut 4 songs. You were paid well for that session and cutting the 4 songs. So hopefully out of those 4 songs, you had a hit or two. it was easy to get all these guys back in to record a full album. And a lot of it was just filler on the album. You'd be lucky if you had a couple of hits. And some people did. Some people started making a big name. So I'm going to bait you with that to start with, and I'll talk more about the business and how George Ann, who I've gone on to, was very good friends with, got me down to Nashville and how I started learning a bunch of this stuff. But I'm going to back up a little bit to some of the people before they were really had big hits. Like, here's one, Roger Miller. Look at this Roger Miller record. And I don't know, Dawn's not behind the camera. I think she's trying to put on her face as they speak. But this is the stuff he had before, you know, his bigger hits and stuff. And Roger, without telling tales out of school, everybody pretty much knew. Roger loved his speed, his white crosses. Roger's best riding, he'd be up for 3 or 4 days straight. And he would just be taking his amphetamine, military-grade amphetamine, bottles of white crosses, racks of white crosses. And when he was in a 3 or 4 day zone of no sleep, he wrote all his best stuff, you know, roller skating, the Buffalo Herd, and, you know, just the big things. And then his son, Buddy's got a show right now with Jim Lauderdale, if any of you guys are on Sirius, which is a great show too, talking about his dad. But his dad was putting out some of these records before he wrote his big hits. So I'm going to spin maybe a record for you from this early Roger Miller one. Let's see what I'll put on. There are a couple of fun ones. Playboy is on here. And Under Your Spell Again. Let me play that one for you too, which is Gary. It's a Buck Owens song. I'll play you that one. Early Roger Miller.
I love his colors.
Oh, isn't that something? Yeah. Lover Girl is back. Oh, wearing cute little outfit.
Oops.
Earthquake. It's California. Those things happen.
What would you guess? A 7.2?
7.2 felt like it. Yeah. You guys will feel it soon. Look at our comment board.
Oh.
Maybe not.
I like it. I'm just all over the place.
Another earthquake. Sorry, guys. It was a little strong. You guys will feel it soon. Don't worry about it. I'll look at comments later. Early Roger Miller. And again, sorry about the earthquakes and so forth here. You guys will be feeling them soon. And I'm going to play a couple more kind of older ones. Last week, after we got off the air, wow, we're on the air,